Hi, this is Ken McCarthy of Jazz on the Tube, and I'd like to try out a new idea on you. This is something that has evolved over a long period of time, and it has to do with nothing more or less than how we look at and appreciate music. I think at one level, obviously, music is a subjective experience. What one person loves, another person's not going to like. Okay. Um, then there's the element of learning more about music. Maybe you learn more about the musician and his or her particular life and other things that they have done in their career. Maybe learn about the sidemen and what their background is. All these things add to the enhancement of your appreciation of the music. Maybe you learn some theory. Maybe you're able to hear the chord changes. You know, the more you know, the more different ways you have to appreciate the music. Lately, I've always been interested in this, and now it's just becoming a lot more conscious. I've always been interested in how somebody makes the leap from just being a kid hearing the music and liking it, to being a teenager actually diving headfirst into it and learning how to play it. There's a great interview. It was done as part of a Wes Montgomery documentary that we featured I guess it's many weeks ago, where Pat Metheny is talking about the process that he went through from being a young fan to a kid that was, jamming in local clubs as a teenager. This same filmmaker did a really good interview with George Benson. Same thing. It's just fascinating, right? And I was lucky enough to have long conversations with Ornette Coleman over the years. And one of the things that stuck with me the most was whenever he would describe what life was like as a kid for him. And I'll never forget, he said in the neighborhood he grew up, there was always live music. And I don't mean that, as a hyperbole or a metaphor. Always. There was a guy playing guitar. You go down half a block, there's a guy playing a comb and wax paper. You go down another half a block, there's three guys singing. You go past another block, you're at church and they're rehearsing. I mean, it was literally live music, not necessarily a formal, full on performance, but music. People lived and breathed music. It was part of the fabric of life, not radio or earbuds or Spotify or any of that stuff. People actually just making music all the time, everywhere. People singing, people walking down the street singing. And this was not unique to Fort Worth when Ornette was growing up. Wasn't even necessarily unique to African American neighborhoods, though I have a feeling there was a lot more of that on average in African American neighborhoods, but also in Italian neighborhoods. People singing arias because that was their music. So very interesting to try to envision not only, okay, we know who recorded it, we know when he recorded it, we know some of his life history, we know where his music fits in this narrative we have of jazz, but what was the daily musical life like for him? Especially when he went through that all important period of going from just a kid loving the music to a teenager immersed in the music, which becomes the foundation for becoming a professional musician. What was the scene like then? So we recently did an interview with Al Jackson of Treme Petit Jazz Museum, and I learned some amazing things from him. He was born in 1943, so he'll be 80 this year. And when he grew up, there was a club across the street, and he saw Fats Domino and Little Richard and Chuck Berry all the time, just walking up and down the street. And because they didn't have air conditioning in those days, the doors were wide open, so they heard that music all the time. And then when he was in his young 20s, that's when the Cuban Revolution occurred, and a lot of Cubans left Cuba, and a lot of them went to New Orleans, and there were a lot of Afro-Cuban music clubs open in New Orleans in the 60s. So this was the musical environment that he lived in. So it's so fascinating. The other thing, I was just reading a book on the jukebox. Now, I was born in 59, So as a kid, I saw jukeboxes, but they were already becoming, kind of semi-museum pieces. I mean, they were still in use, but they were novelties. But from reading this book, in the 40s and 50s, jukeboxes were it. In fact, there were a lot of independent labels. Uh, Half of their sales went to jukeboxes, right? So half went to consumers and the other half went to jukeboxes. And what existed in the early days of rock, what they call rock, was you'd have a guy with a jukebox route, okay, and he wanted to have the best possible records so that they would play a lot and he'd get a lot of nickels, right? I mean, it was just pure commerce. And what they would do when the records got old is they would resell them to consumers. And then that led to, hey, let's record our own records with local talent. And that led to, hey, let's work with the radio stations to play the tunes so that when people go to the diner or the cafeteria or the restaurant or the juke joint or wherever it is, they'll put the nickel in and play our music. And then that evolved into, larger music sales, record shops and things like that. By the way, that's how it worked in Liverpool too. If you read the biography of George Martin, record shops were an artifact of the post-war era when people had money, and the first records that were sold, not the only records, but a lot of records that were sold were used jukebox records. So, and the other thing too is that not everybody had a record player, had the means to play music at home. I mean, imagine that. We've got CD players and record players and Spotify and the internet and, MP3 players. And, we got music everywhere. There were a lot of people that didn't even have record players in their homes. So if they wanted to hear music, they'd either have to go to a live place to hear it, or they'd go someplace where there was a jukebox. And then when you have the rock and roll revolution, a lot of kids couldn't play the rock and roll at home. Even if there was a record player, their parents weren't into it. So they had to go where the jukebox was and play it. So now we don't have jukeboxes anymore, but that was, there was a time when that was what a big part of what music was built around. Now, speaking of rock and roll, what Al was telling me in this interview, and it's in our podcast interviews. If you go to our homepage, jazzonthetube.com, and you go to podcasts and you go to Jazz on the Tube interviews, you'll find that interview and over 100 other interviews. They're starting to add up over the years. But Al was saying when he was a kid in New Orleans, and this is pre-Elvis, it was all rock and roll. So the first city in America to really embrace rock and roll was New Orleans. This is, and again, this was pre-Elvis, and this is what the kids of New Orleans were listening to, African-American kids. And they called it rock and roll. They didn't call it rhythm and blues or anything else. And it was big. There were lots of clubs and lots of dances and lots of bands. And Cosimo Metaxas was recording a lot of stuff, and he, his family had a jukebox route, and all those jukeboxes were packed with his music, and the radio stations were playing it. And speaking of understanding the history, why were there so many early white rock and rollers from northern Louisiana and from Mississippi, like Elvis? They were listening to the New Orleans radio station. Done. Right? Answered. And when those records were heard, when that music was heard beyond the borders of New Orleans, it created a demand in the jukeboxes so the kids could come out and hear it. And so the rock and roll really, I don't know why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland. That's ridiculous. It should have been in New Orleans, because that's really where the music started, and that's how it started. Right? It started with local people playing, and then Metaxas recording it, getting it into the jukeboxes, getting it on the radio, and then that radio blasting it out beyond the borders of New Orleans into the rest of Louisiana, into Mississippi, into other places, and then that process repeating itself, right, with the jukeboxes getting full and kids coming out and hearing the music. So, knowing these little details just makes it, for me at least, it makes the whole appreciation. It enhances the appreciation of music. So I not only know, okay, who's playing, that's good. What's his history? That's good. Of according to the books, what was he embedded in? Was he a bebopper? Was he a hard bopper? Was he free jazz? Okay, well, that's really interesting. But I think what's really interesting is to try to envision any kind of music that you hear when it was brand new and what environment it was in. And now here's the key point. Um, who were the people that actually created it? So I'm really into this, and I'm going to be doing a lot of looking and talking about. Now, here's a mind-boggling thing. It's now 2023. Bebop was flourishing in the 40s and then, of course, the 50s, but 40s is when it kind of exploded on the scene. So let's say 1943. That's 80 years ago, folks. That's like bebop is it's coming up on a century old. And, just like we don't have World War I veterans to talk to anymore, we don't have a whole lot of bebop veterans. I mean, people that were in the bebop trenches when bebop was new, when bebop was the revolutionary thing. It's so easy if you've got this chronology in your head, right? First we had, Dixieland, and we had swing, then we had bebop, then we had, no, it was a live, vibrant, brand new, newborn creation at one time in a particular environment, and there were a particular group of people that were doing it who came from a particular background, right? So if we look at bebop, for example, you have Charlie Parker. And can I read my handwriting here? I have him written as born in 1920. So what does that mean? That means when he was a teenager in Kansas City, he was immersed in maybe the greatest music scene of all time, right? Kansas City, the whole city was turned over to music, just club after club after club after club after club. And that was his foundation to take that and take it further. Dizzy was born in 1917, so he was a little bit older. Bud Powell, 1924, a little bit younger. Miles Davis, 26. So he was like sort of the youngster on the bandstand when he was playing. He was the young kid. And then you had this other interesting cohort of people who were born in 1930, Sonny Rollins, Barry Harris, and Ornette Coleman. Now, and make no mistake, Ornette Coleman was a bebopper, okay? He got thrown off his high school band for playing bebop. And he didn't do it on stage, but I can tell you, he knew every Charlie Parker lick inside and out and upside and down. And if you listen to his playing, you hear a lot of Charlie Parker licks. Usually and the funny thing is, if you listen to Charlie Parker, you'll hear a lot of stuff that later became Ornette Coleman licks. So anyway, the guys born in 1930, they were in their teenage years when bebop was the brand new, hottest thing, never before seen, no precedent, no books, no schools, no classes, no nothing. It was just happening. And if you wanted to be part of it, you had to figure it out on your own. There's a great interview with Barry Harris talking about he knew how to comp on piano, but he didn't know how to solo. So one of his girlfriends, lent him a record player because he didn't have one, and a Bud Powell record. And apparently he spent a weekend just intensely studying that Bud Powell record. And by the end of the weekend, he knew how to solo. I mean, he had a beginning of what to do. This is very different than getting a book or going to a class or having somebody explain it to you. But if you remember what it was like to be a teenager, it's a very passionate time of your life. You're finally out on your own, and everything is so vibrant and so amazing, and you're trying to establish your identity. Imagine what it would have been like to be Ornette Coleman or Barry Harris or Sonny Rollins as a teenager, when people like Charlie Parker and Bud Powell and Monk were just tearing it up for the first time, brand new, right? And I think we should when we listen to, I'm just suggesting this, right? When we listen to music, we should, there's the your own subjective experience, and it is what it is. And then people like to know, well, whose music is this? Well, who's the player, right? And gee, when was this recorded? And what style is this? All these things are really valuable, but a really interesting mental exercise is to say, okay, what was going on when this music was brand new? What did the world look like? What was the music technology like, right? So in the 40s, you did have jukeboxes. You had the breakdown of the big bands. They just couldn't, they were, this thing that was the big dominant artistic thing in the 30s was starting to break down in the 40s. So you're starting to have for the first time lots and lots of small groups. And of course you had radio. You didn't have TV. You certainly didn't have the internet. You had clubs where people would go just to listen. That was an innovation because listen, jazz, and first of all, they didn't even call it jazz. Like I've got all these records that I'm looking at now from Benny Carter, the great alto player. And these are things recorded in like 29 and even into the 30s. The labels don't say jazz, they say foxtrot. It's true the first jazz record was recorded by the whatever that band was from New Orleans in 1919 or whatever it was. But it wasn't like there was a jazz, section of the record store. There weren't even that many record stores. Here's my point. The music was completely tied to dancing pre-bebop. Okay, just wrap your mind around that. There was no such thing as going to a jazz concert in the 1920s or the 1930s. Maybe some one-off kind of thing, but that's not how it worked. Jazz was the accompaniment to dancing. And this is the same thing with what's called salsa. And of course, salsa is a record label invention, and it's an umbrella. And under that umbrella, there's all these different kinds of music, all of which originated in Cuba. But in any event, that music, 100% dancing, right? No such thing as a salsa concert pre our modern era. So that's an interesting thing to realize about music. There were no Duke Ellington concerts. When he was at the Cotton Club, he was playing for a review with dancing girls and I think jugglers. Who knows what was going on, but it was for a stage show. And it just happened to be high art and great art. So, that whole bebop era was really the first time that people just sat down and said, we're going to listen to jazz. We're going to groove on this jazz, and we're going to treat it as seriously as we would treat a Beethoven quartet. That was a first. So I'd imagine being a teenager, right? At that time, very, very, very exciting period. Anyway, I found this video of a guy that's thinking the same way I am. His name is Lionel Leinvand, Leinvand, and I believe he's from St. Louis. He's a piano player, and he is in love with the music called Barrel House Blues. And you're going to hear him say this, but I'm going to give you a little prelude to it. We think of the blues as, this sort of rural thing and, some old guys on a porch and with an old guitar and he's just singing by himself. And that's not what the blues was about. Blues was nothing. That's what we saw in the folk revival of the 60s. We saw the guys that had already been around for decades and decades. Yeah, they were old by that time. But when they started the music, they were young. They were teenagers. They were 20 years old. This was the hot, brand new music of the age, right? And these guys, it was the young musicians that were the innovators. I mean, look at Charlie Parker, right? He was in his 20s when he was leading the bebop revolution. And it's kind of always that way with music. It's just the nature of the art form. And so this guy makes a beautiful point that this barrel house jazz piano that we're listening to, again, in the folk revival, we're hearing it from an 80-year-old guy, God bless him. But it was not invented by 80-year-old guys. It was invented by teenagers. I just find that because because blues was already in the air when they were growing up, and they wanted to put their own stamp on it. So what we're really hearing when we hear Barrel House Blues is not some ancient music from old guys, you know. It is actually a music invented by young people in a particular time, in a particular period of history, in a particular technological environment. Because one thing becomes really clear if you study the history of music, the technology. There was a time when there was no recorded music, right? And then there was a time when recorded music was like a one horn, or I don't know even what you'd call it, sitting in the middle of a room, and all the musicians had to be placed around it correctly and had to play in perfect, volume. Everyone had to play the right volume. You couldn't even have drums, right? That's why they had wood blocks, because you couldn't even have a drum set in a setup like that. That was recording, right? There was a time when record needles wore out after 5 plays. Did you know that? Right. And of course, everybody knows about 78s and then 33s and then 45s. Right? So you went through all that evolution. And then, of course, the amazing thing of being able to listen to music of your own choosing in your car. That didn't always exist. That's a, in the scope of music history, that's a relatively new thing. And then, of course, the Walkman, which was a 1970s kind of, well, the transistor radio was the first portable music where you could walk around, and now you had to listen to the music that somebody else chose for you, which is kind of interesting. We've gone full circle, right? What is Spotify? Somebody else is choosing the music, right? But in the 50s, now you had a transistor, you could have a little thing in your ear, you go around, live in your own musical environment. So we've kind of changed that, enhanced it a little bit 50 years later, 60 years later, but anyway, none of that stuff existed when Barrel House Blues was invented by teenagers. I just want to stress this point. So I find this interesting. This is what I find interesting. So we're going to hear we're going to hear a little performance, and then we're going to hear part of Lionel's commentary, which I think is very interesting. And I think then there's another little performance, and then on the page below, I'm going to give the link to his entire lecture, which is absolutely fascinating. So if I hit the correct buttons, all will go well. And I think I have. And here we go.
His big hit comes in 1914 when he comes out with St. Louis Blues. And St. Louis Blues is basically in a song form, and there's a verse and there's a chorus. And the verse is that iconic tango. And then it's a song. Now, when W.C. Handy recorded it, it sounds a lot like a rag. It's more like... Over time, that's going to start to sound more like... and take on some of those really sweet swinging qualities. But what's happened then with this song is blues has, boom, entered the popular music scene. It exploded. And then what you have for the next half a decade, from 1915 to 1920, is blues, and into the early 20s, is blues at its most popular than it will ever be in any other time. And we don't really tell that story. For us, blues, if we're talking about blues history, so music history in general, it's about where you are today, right? That's what makes music history so interesting. You really want to tell the story of why are we where we at today? And where we're at today is like Eric Clapton. Like if we think about the blues story that got sort of co-opted or used up is how you get to Eric Clapton and those guitar heroes. And that's a story through Muddy Waters and that kind of electric blues into the Delta, the Robert Johnson story, and sort of the guys who he learned from, Son House and Charlie Patton and those folks. And that's one way to tell the story, but it leaves out when really blues was at its most popular. And in this time, blues enters the popular music, and it's everywhere. It's infused itself into all the old ragtime, into the popular songs. And if you are And so you had this great, folk blues tradition, but really people learn about it through the popular blues tradition. So they've all melded together. And when you come back down south and you picture a 16-year-old African American kid in 1919 in Louisiana or Mississippi, this is their youth music. Like, this is the thing they're growing up with, this is the thing they're most proud of, this is the thing they want to play that their parents don't necessarily understand, but it's their music. And I think we too often make the mistake in blues of only imagining the old black fella on the porch, just playing that music, because that's sort of how the folk revival showed it to be. But really, it's a youth music, and I think that's an important part, and that's to me how you come to understand Barrel House Blues and what's about to happen. So what you have is all these great young kids in 1919, 1920, these 16-year-old kids hanging out with each other in different areas around the country, and they're saying this is what I can do with the blues. So they all start to give their own touches to it, and this is really where Barrel House Blues emerges. To me, it's that combination of basically popular blues re-emerging as a new folk tradition. And that's what this great music is all about to me. So now I want to get into some of that Barrel House Blues. We sort of set it up, and the first thing I want to play is a tune that comes from the Vicksburg area in the early 20s. It's a song called the 44 Blues, or the Vicksburg Blues. It has this great history. You basically have all these young kids starting to play with this idea, this sort of idea of these great little rolls instead of, what was before just a strict stride or things, you have these, and kind of hitting the piano fast, sort of doing some train imitation stuff. But the idea is, so it's called the 44. So the 44s was a train that ran from in Mississippi from Vicksburg to Belzoni, which is nothing. This is a hyper-local train, and why would they choose that tune? Because it was a hyper-local tune, and that's how they wanted to separate it. This is our insider tune, just like if you listen to like a hip-hop song today, they might be rapping about, a train or bus they take that might not mean anything to you, but to them, it's their community, that's what they're speaking to. And this is the same thing that's happening then. So it was their way of being like, oh man, you don't know the 44s, well, you're not really hip to this thing. And so this was how this tune developed amongst a group of piano players. And so we learn about it in 1929. It first gets recorded by Roosevelt Sykes, the great St. Louis, well, he was down south and in St. Louis, Arkansas and St. Louis, piano player, and he put great words to it. I wore my 44 so long, sure made my shoulder sore. But before that, it was about the train, it was more the 44 train, which just ran from like 1917 to 1921. That was it, and it was gone. But I'm going to do a version. So there was all this drama attached to that tune because Little Brother thought that he wrote it, him and a bunch of piano players and most guys that never got to record, Ernest Johnson and Long Tall Friday and all these guys. They're just names now, but to me, I totally nerd out about it. When he's just listing off the names, there was, like Big Brother Johnson and whatever, all these guys. But he says that there was this fella named Pork Chop. And Pork Chop, his real name was Lee Green, so he actually did record. So Lee Green, who was a tailor, a clothes presser, and back then, if you were a clothes presser, like you need a lot of muscle. That's not dainty work. And he was a clothes presser, and he really wanted to learn the 44s, this, according to Little Brother. And Little Brother was kind of always bitter about this because Lee Green went on and taught Roosevelt Sykes this tune, and then Sykes was the first person to record it. So he sort of beat Little Brother to it in 1929, and then Roosevelt and Lee Green and even this fellow from Chicago, all these people recorded it before Little Brother got his chance to show, a tune that he thought that rightfully was sort of his piece. So it was always a point of contention, moving forward. And really what happened was Roosevelt Sykes had a hit with it. I mean, it wasn't just like, it was an important piece. And this piece later on is covered by Howlin' Wolf, Eric Clapton, our boy, all that stuff. So it was really important. And what happens after 1929 is the Depression, right? The Depression hits, and if you were a blues recording artist at that time, only the most popular were being recorded. So Roosevelt kind of got to record through that era. Most other piano players, like Little Brother Montgomery, wouldn't be able to record again until 1935. So he kind of lost out in multiple ways and was always a little bitter about it. So here's my version. I'm gonna sort of meld a little bit of the Lee Green style, a little bit of Little Brother style to give you the Vicksburg or the 44 blues. Got all that sweet rolls, and my little brother would say is you just gotta roll your hand and open it. See, we'll teach little kids how to do that. And he shows some examples of him, like the stuff he used to learn, how his progression of learning, and one of the very first things that he shows is like taking the blues and then like really learning that way, and because yeah, that was the thing.
Okay. Do you like that? I like that a lot. And I guess the point is there's no such thing as old music, right? And it's very, very, because of the way our minds work, it's very easy to put things in boxes. Oh, that's old piano blues. That's barrel house blues. That's some old thing. But if you can put your mind in it, and now it's 1919 and you're 16 years old, and one of your friends is showing off this invention that's never been heard before on the planet. And then you expand that imagination a little bit and realize nobody really had record players, or they were rare as can be. There were no jukeboxes then, no radio, right? So this must have been an amazing sonic experience for the people that had it. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. The fellow who's put this talk together is Lionel Leinvand. I think that's how you would pronounce it, Leinvand. I believe he's out of St. Louis. We're going to put his entire presentation, which was made at a place in Brooklyn called Jalopy, below on this page. You can watch the whole thing. But I think this sort of mental exercise, in the best sense of the word, mental exercise, is something that can make can take your musical appreciation and enhance it dramatically, and maybe even open doors to new dimensions of music that you might not have ever considered before, because you put a box around it and said, oh, that's old, or that's blues, that's not really, that's not hip. Well, this music was extremely hip for its time, and actually, why isn't it hip now? If you put it in all those contexts, it sounds pretty hip to me. So I hope you enjoyed this. Jazz on the Tube saying goodbye.